how do we distinguish between sort of normal inner voices, reasoning or guiding voices, and something that is psychosis or, even worse, demonic?
That's an important question and is something that the church tries to be careful with. Certainly when we're evaluating whether somebody's possessed, we don't just take their word for it. They say, I'm possessed, I want an exorcism. Many people say that, and most of them are mentally ill. Um, so the church looks for other signs to corroborate that, beyond just hearing a voice.
Here we go. Hello and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, Davide Battistella. Find the Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. Adam BLAI, a layman, is a peritus, church-decreed expert in religious demonology and exorcism for the Diocese of Pittsburgh. He's also served as an expert in these areas in training priests, deacons, and laity in many other dioceses. He is an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, a Vatican-recognized private association of the Christian faithful based in Rome. Over 15 years of working and training in the exorcism ministry, he has witnessed or experienced a number of miracles, some of which he has been appointed to investigate by the Church. He also works in the tribunal of the Pittsburgh Diocese and is pursuing a canon law degree. Adam is the author of the book, The Catholic Guide to Miracles. And joining me now on the Focusing Way podcast from the Diocese of Pittsburgh is author Adam BLAI. Adam, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, David.
The book is so rich. I just wanted to share how much I enjoyed the book and how much I've been going back to it to revisit the stories. But I just wanted to open up, if you could tell me a bit about the work you do and how it influenced you to create a book about Catholic miracles.
Well, I do a um, few different kind of functions in the church. So for the last 15 years, I'm a layman, not a priest, not a deacon. For the last 15 years, I've been drawn into the world of exorcism and have been helping to train exorcists nationally here in the States and now internationally. And that has, informed a lot of my life. I started in adult clinical psychology. I was in a PhD program when I got involved in this and did some forensic work in psychology in the prison system here, and then got exposed to the more kind of manifest spiritual world in the form of the demonic and the exorcisms. But along the way, I encountered a number of miracles that, I had either personally experienced or had close friends that experienced. And then, of course, seeing a repetition of the gospel stories of the exorcisms play out, hundreds of times. And so I thought it would be perhaps useful to highlight the positive side of these kind of unusual events. So I had written a little bit about the negative side with what the demonic does to kind of catechize people and warn them about what to stay away from. And I thought there might be a place for conversion if God used the book in exploring the positive.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating field. And before we get into that aspect of it, I just wanted to ask if you could just give our listeners a kind of a brief overview of how the Catholic Church defines, recognizes, and categorizes miracles.
Sure. So at the very basic level, a miracle is something only God can do. And then if we want to parse that apart, Thomas Aquinas helps us and breaks it down into kind of three levels. And that's when God does something that nature cannot do, like the sun dancing in the sky at Fatima. That's something that just doesn't happen in nature, or if it did, that would be the end of the earth probably. Secondly would be when God does something nature does, but in a different order. So we naturally go from physical life to physical death eventually. But when Lazarus was raised, he went from death to life. So it's kind of a resurrection would be something natural, but in an order that doesn't happen. And then thirdly, when God does something, nature does, but much faster. So like an instantaneous healing instead of a natural recovery from disease.
Mm, okay. And they're these they're studied in a very precise way. Can you just give a little bit about how much detail the Catholic Church goes into to confirm a miracle?
Yes, it depends on the miracle and the circumstance. But basically, the church seeks an outside validation and outside scrutiny, and always takes a kind of critical stance to these things, kind of a skeptical stance. So the church would not assume at first blush that, well, they said it happened, so it must have happened. In fact, it's the opposite. The church first looks for any mundane explanation, looks for, if appropriate, looks for mental illness in the person. Could this just be a scam? Could this be a misunderstanding, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm.
And when the church looks at things like Eucharistic miracles, she would rely on outside qualified medical experts that in many cases are not told where the sample they're looking at was from so that they won't be biased.
Hmm.
When the church is looking at healings, relies on outside medical experts to evaluate the healing based on a number of criteria. And so in the case of healings, it's very strict, and that is that the healing be instantaneous, complete, lasting, and have no other explanation.
Wow. Yeah, I was really captivated by the very first lines in the book, and I'd like to just share them, and I'll just read them. So the book opens like this: Our fascination with miracles is inextricably tied up with our fear of death. Miracles give us hope for preservations from fear of suffering and ultimately an escape from death. They not only give us a short term solution to a problem facing us, but more importantly, they reveal the reality of God and so give us hope for the ultimate solution to the problem of death. I was in, I have to say, as an opening part of a book. As soon as I read that, I just, I want to just compliment you on bringing us in such an incredible way at the start. But I just wanted to ask you, how can the knowledge of miracles deepen and enrich uh, our Catholic faith or someone's faith?
Well, I think Paul, you know, makes it clear when he refers to the resurrection of Jesus that it's kind of a linchpin. It's a required uh, tenet of our faith that if the resurrection didn't happen, our faith is empty. And so, in a sense, miracles provide the proof events that allow us to rest on our faith and feel secure in it. Without the miracles, we would just have a secondhand recollection or somebody telling us how to live or think or pray, but we wouldn't have that proof that God was active and continues to be active for us personally. Jesus talks about providing signs to people that are seeking them and talks about having faith without signs. And so makes it, very clear he's doing these things not only for the people he's helping, but also doing them for those that are watching. And that's kind of us. And in some cases, we're watching 2,000 years later through words, but they're still equally important. And when we feel a sense of surety that those events happened, they provide the proofs upon which we base our hope and our trust and our faith. So in a sense, they're very critical. They were critical in the Old Testament. They were critical for the Jews. Um, they were critical in the time of Jesus, and I think they're equally critical now, both in a retrospective sense of building our faith on what's recorded, but then also the miracles that continue to happen. A lot of talk about Medjugorje and whether those visionary experiences were all valid. That's
Hmm.
very important to many people.
Yeah.
Thousands of priestly vocations came out of Medjugorje based on, people go there because they heard there's miracles happening on a daily or weekly basis.
Hmm.
So, miracles, they're powerful ideas. They can transform a human life. They can take a human life and lift it out of the track it's in and place it in a radically different one. And there's not many things in life that can do that.
Yeah, you mentioned Medjugorje, and it's still in the air. I mean, there was a recent, it was included in one of the month of prayer recently by Pope Francis, but it still hasn't been confirmed uh, officially. And so it just goes that, and those miracles have been happening for 40 years. And so it just goes to show you how cautious the Catholic Church is with these. They don't pounce on these events. They really do deep investigations. So um,
Hmm.
yeah, and so you know, your book, The Catholic Guide to Miracles, recounts so many beautiful miracles in the Catholic faith, and I mean everything from the incorrupt bodies of saints. For anyone who doesn't understand that term, it means the body of the saint which remained intact after life and never decomposed, sometimes for centuries, and very often a sweet scent emanates from the saint, from the body. Or there's
Hmm.
miracles of levitation, bilocation, apparitions of Mary, miraculous healings, Eucharistic miracles, which you mentioned. And uh, I just, after living this so much, I really would just like to ask you, which miracles fascinate you the most?
Hmm. That's a good question. Um, I would say right now, because it's something that I've had a lot of personal contact with, and I'm coming to terms with the implications of it, kind of on a personal psychological level, would be stigmata.
Hmm.
And so, uh, you know, we all, well, most people know Padre Pio having the stigmata, the wounds of Christ's crucifixion in his hands, and he had other of the wounds, and Saint Francis was probably the first person. Paul from the Bible may have been the first.
Hmm.
We know about that in kind of an abstract, distant way, but to see it personally in front of you, to see the wounds appear spontaneously, and by the way, there's a scent of flowers
Wow.
that comes from the wounds when they're active. Uh, you know, kind of in a similar way to the incorruptibles you mentioned.
Hmm.
But I would say psychologically, for me, the implications are interesting and powerful. And so that Christ would ask a person now to participate in some limited way, because I don't think any one person could bear it all,
Hmm.
to participate in some limited way in the passion, and then offer that suffering up, in this case for the vocations to the priesthood. Um, Boy, that that's a powerful idea for me,
Yeah.
and it makes me wrestle with and try to come to terms with the idea of suffering, and
Hmm.
not only God's permissive will of allowing suffering, but in this case, it's His will that that person, if they choose, this is not involuntary.
Yeah.
They know they know they could say no at any time, but they choose to say yes.
Hmm.
you know but I think it's interesting, and it'll take a lifetime to work through it. um but the economy of suffering, if I could use that phrase, uh is interesting, and it's something that some writers have touched on down through the centuries, but the stigmata kind of makes that very concrete.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm just absorbing the fact that you personally have witnessed and experienced this, and you're willing to share it in that way. And I just appreciating that so much, the grace that is. And, but I want to, because a lot of our focusing listeners, because focusing is very much used as an adjunct to psychotherapy, and especially in deep trauma work.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, I just want to have a small discussion about healthy psychotherapy and when it can be moving into other territory. So, for
Hmm.
example, in focusing in psychotherapy, we refer to inner parts work, and parts is short for partial
Hmm.
selves, which can be like a part of ourselves that is wounded or hurt from past experiences, or with deep trauma, these parts can be a wounded child within, for example. And this can be
Hmm.
a very powerful way for a person to discover or understand a trauma or assist them with PTSD if they're suffering. But I also wanted to ask you about how do we distinguish between sort of normal inner voices, reasoning or guiding voices, and something that is psychosis or, even worse, demonic.
Hmm. Yeah. So that's an important question, and is something that the church tries to be careful with. Certainly when we're evaluating whether somebody's possessed, we don't just take their word for it. They say, I'm possessed, I want an exorcism. Many people say that, and most of them are mentally ill. Um, so the church looks for other signs to corroborate that, beyond just hearing a voice. Now, there are certain qualitative aspects of the demonic voices that come with possession that we know those patterns, but we have to be careful. That wouldn't be enough
Hmm.
to say we have moral certainty. So in the case of the demonic, we look for the four classic signs, which is knowledge of all languages. So schizophrenia doesn't make you fluent in Greek. Um, you know, I've had many experiences, both verbal and even, I know it may sound funny to people, but even receiving a text in Greek from a possessed person that I had to go and find a scholar of ancient languages to translate it.
Wow.
Um, we've had spirits use ancient Icelandic with a grammatical structure from about 600 years ago, and Icelandic is a very obscure language, at least here in the United States.
Yeah.
Um, um, we had a person that only spoke English with a high school education, asked questions in English, French, Latin, Lithuanian, and German, and properly responded to all the questions. So mental illness doesn't make you suddenly fluent in all languages. So that's one of the signs.
Wow.
Uh, n- Knowing hidden things. So mental illness doesn't make you suddenly know somebody's secrets or just the mundane events in their life over the weekend when that person wasn't there. And these would be very specific, not general, like, oh, you had breakfast on Saturday, but something very specific. So there's hidden knowledge. Then there's reacting to the holy. Mental illness doesn't make you able to tell me which saint's relic is in my pocket
Wow.
spontaneously without me even bringing up that there's a saint's relic present. And then the supernatural strength or strength beyond their condition. And that's the weakest because if you've worked in psychiatric settings, inpatient settings, you know that psychotic people can become extremely strong for a brief period of time
Hmm.
through an adrenaline rush. The difference here is they never get tired, it never stops. So
Wow.
two or three hours later, uh, 2 or 3 hours later, everybody's exhausted and they haven't lost, even 1% of their strength, and they don't show any signs of exertion.
Wow.
So in terms of the demonic, the church looks for these concrete signs that have been figured out over the centuries from well over 1,000 years of experience with this.
Hmm. Wow, that's incredible and very helpful, and I really appreciate you sharing in that way. And I was as I was reflecting on the book, and I've really, really enjoyed so much of it. And while it recounts so much beauty of all of these confirmed miracles in the Catholic faith, it is also filled with many warnings. And I mean, you recount wonderful stories about false healers and demonic counterfeits. Can you briefly tell the story of how Sister Magdalena of the Cross shows us how prudent we have to be when it comes to where we place our faith?
Sure. So Sister Magdalena's story, which the original documents are in Latin in Rome. Um, they've only been translated, as far as I know, once. They could probably use a full translation again at some point. But this is an event that happened in Spain in the Middle Ages. Um, spoiler alert, but she had, as a child, been approached by a demonic spirit, and she had agreed to a contract with that spirit that in exchange for influence and power and fame, she would agree to be possessed. And she had made that agreement, and then through the course of her life had become a nun, had become the superior of her convent, and had become increasingly abusive to the nuns that were under her authority. And she had done all this as a result of very extraordinary, what seemed to be miraculous signs that would happen around her and through her apparent intercession. But these were shams created by the devil in order to hold up his end of the bargain, so to speak. Though, of course, the devil never really gives you what you try to bargain for, nor does he pay attention to everybody that wants to bargain with him. But in her case, provided these sham experiences. So, for instance, she claimed to have a pregnancy as a virgin, similar to Mary's pregnancy, and her stomach distended, and she showed some of the signs of pregnancy. But in fact, there was none. It was just a biological sham. There was no baby there. And so there was a number of things like that. In the end, many years later, after great fame, royalty coming to see her, people deferring to her, great amounts of money being donated to the convent because of her fame, it kind of unraveled, and it became clear that this was demonic. She repented in the end and lived out her life, repenting for her sins. And she was freed through exorcism and basically lived normally, the remainder of her days.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a cautionary tale, I think, not only for the extraordinary things, but even if just the con artists who claim to have extraordinary access to God. They don't have to be flying around the room and levitating in order to scam us. They can just claim to have this privileged access to God, and some people, that's enough. They'll sell everything and follow that person. And so, it's a cautionary tale, I think, about con artists in general, whether the devil's helping them or not.
Yeah. I mean, I want to share a personal story here. And while I was on retreat in Italy, I befriended a priest who was doing spiritual exercises, and I was as well. And over one of our lunches, I discovered he was an exorcist. And sort of in my discomfort with the subject matter and because of my own ignorance, I hadn't really appreciated the seriousness of this work because of how we sort of experience it in our culture as kind of it gets mainstreamed, and it that sort of, I don't know if it takes away from it or something, but over the course of the week, he really helped me appreciate the seriousness of what people experience. And he told me a very mild story, but had a great impact on me. And I was just wondering, based on your experiences, how would you ask people to be more careful about their activities or to raise their awareness about the forces of evil?
Well, I think, if we look at books like Hostage to the Devil from Malachi Martin, you see an approach there of telling kind of the horror stories of what can happen from the demonic. But the problem with that, I think, is that it puts the devil at the center of the story, and it puts fear and ugliness as the focus of the person's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So instead, I would encourage people to reflect on the first commandment, to love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul, to not have other gods before God, to not place another spirit before God, depending on which version of the Ten Commandments you're reading in Scripture. But essentially, it's put God first is the first commandment. Now, it's probably first for a reason, because it's very important. And what we see at the core of basically every extraordinary demonic case we deal with, whether it's oppression, infestation or possession, is a violation of the first commandment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because what you're doing at some level, the person is turning to this other spirit than God and basically asking them for either comfort, information, or power in some way. And when you do that, you're telling God, I don't trust you. I'm not going to wait on you. I want what I want when I want it, and that's now. And I'm going to get it over here. And so you break your friendship with God and you start a friendship with another spirit. And that other spirit is not going to be a holy angel because they're not going to draw you away from God. Not going to be a saint in heaven. They're not going to draw you away from God. It's not a soul in purgatory because they're moving towards God and they're not going to draw you into mortal sin. So what do you have left? You have the demons and the damned souls. And so though it's pretending to be your fairy godmother or your grandmother, and though it knows certain things from your past that seem extraordinary, that's just because the demonic spirits watch us and they remember these things. You have really entered into the beginning of that relationship. And if the relationship deepens, it becomes these extraordinary demonic problems. And I would just reflect on that and reflect on how many modern phenomenon that we can engage in our cultures. So the normalization of Wicca and witchcraft, the kind of excitement about Reiki and energy manipulation in whatever form, various new age systems that purport to manipulate this vague quote unquote energy that isn't really defined. But if it's God, who are we to push God around and use God?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yoga at its deeper levels beyond just the stretching are worship postures from a pagan religion. And at the level of Kundalini yoga, seeks to awaken the spirit of a serpent at the base of your spine that'll move up to your head and cause involuntary body movements and animal-like vocalizations called kriyas.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
if you reflect on these kind of things through the lens of the first commandment, you see, I think, hopefully more clearly why they're forbidden. And it's not out of God being mean and being a curmudgeon-y old man who doesn't want you to have any fun in life. God is putting that rule there because he's the spirit that loves you.
Yeah.
And these deceptive spirits do not love you. They only want to separate you from God. And he's trying to keep you safe from that.
That is such a succinct and beautiful explanation, Adam. I just so appreciate how you've articulated that. And in one of the most profound chapters of the book, you tell a personal story of a woman who's a stigmatic, and you mentioned this earlier in our discussion. And she's been living the passion of Jesus Christ for over 15 years, each week on Thursday and Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And this is stuff you've witnessed firsthand. I mean, it's incredible. But I just wanted to ask you, as a creative person, can you share why it was hard, why you struggle with including that chapter, and what was the process you went through?
Well, my initial thought, because those events were going on when I was working on this book, and I had planned to write a chapter on stigmata because it's a well-known miracle that many people are interested in, and I thought the history of it would be useful for people. And I knew this was going on at the time, and my initial thought was to absolutely not include it because this is a very personal event going on in an individual's life, and it just seemed too personal. You don't want to put too much detail out there and have somebody end up being bothered by people or harassed by people. This person had the very strong inclination through prayer, not just on a human level, to keep this quiet and secret, not in a mean or bad way, but just that this was a personal thing between them and God. They didn't promote it. They don't talk about it. They kept it hidden. the doctors tried to treat the wounds over the years, because in the early years they didn't understand what was going on, and so they were seeking medical help, but they never could find an explanation for them. But through the person praying and their experiences between them and Jesus during the Passion story, which is, for a person going through that, is a very intimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at Anne Catherine Emmerich's recounting of her experiences of the stigmata. It's a very personal kind of union with that story and with Christ. Well, anyway, they had felt very strongly from Jesus and Michael, the archangel, that the story was to be included in the book and that Jesus wanted it written down. And that was for two reasons. He wanted people to hear again the deeper and very human details of what he went through for us. Not that the Stations of the Cross are deficient, they're not. But when we read accounts from people like Anne Catherine Emmerich, the Dolorous Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ, or perhaps this account through the grace of God, we might be inspired to a deeper kind of visceral reaction and understanding of it. So he wanted that conveyed, and it's his grace that will do that if that happens. It's got nothing to do with my writing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing he wanted highlighted was the importance of the Our Father to be prayed in a more deep and reverent and personal way, perhaps inspired through an understanding of the Our Father as the prayer that, in a sense, would apply to the garden. Please take this cup away, but if it's your will, let it be done. Perhaps even from the cross, we can imagine this applying through that journey in different ways. And so, because it seemed that the phenomenon met the Church's criteria historically for stigmata, and because the person was feeling that Jesus wanted it, that's the reason it's in the book.
So wonderful. I just have to ask, how do you spiritually prepare for what you witness and confront when you're doing this work?
Which part of the work? You mean the exorcisms?
Yeah, how do you how do you be in the right? I mean, obviously it's got to be completely and fully in Christ's love. But is there anything you could share about where you draw your strength or how you prepare for these moments?
Well, honestly, God, at least in my case, did it from the beginning in terms of preparation. So from the very first time, I was in a room with a possessed person there along with their exorcist. A case that had been going for years at that point. I didn't have any fear, and it wasn't about bravado or courage or playing a cognitive game and convincing myself I shouldn't be afraid. It just simply wasn't there, and I felt very matter of fact about it, and it's always been that way. And so I think God takes away that fear. And I've since seen that happen in so many priests that have been called to this ministry, where they've said that, before they engaged in it, they imagined that they would be afraid doing this. And on a human level, they would say objectively, intellectually, I'm afraid of it. But yet when I step in that room, I know what I need to do and there is no fear. It's just a very straightforward thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I think God does. And that's part of an indication that he's calling a person to be involved in this. Of course, the most important is that the bishop is asking them to be involved in it. That has to happen at some level, even for those just assisting and being in the room. If it's through the exorcist, ultimately it's the bishop's ministry. So you can't just self-appoint yourself and say, well, I feel comfortable, so I should be allowed to be here. This is the church's ministry first and foremost. So that's something that's just been in place. It wasn't about me.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of preparation, you want to go to confession. You don't want to have unconfessed mortal sin on you. because they'll certainly, use that as a distraction and bring that up and talk about your sins openly in the room, that kind of thing. Though that doesn't happen as much as the movies make it out. And the other thing is, when you're there, you pray deeply. And, that's a tough word to define, deeply, but you're praying, you're very present. You're trying to put all of yourself in your prayers. It's not just saying words. It's not even just saying the prayer half-heartedly. There is a strong expression of the self directed to God, a very strong yearning for the presence of God in that moment. It's a very intense time of prayer that goes on for hours, especially if you have multiple cases. And so, stay away from mortal sin, go to confession, go to Mass. When you get there, the Holy Spirit helps you. You stay on point. You stay very focused and deep in prayer the entire time. But outside of that, it's up to the person. If a person was a priest, they'd be having their sacramental life in place just through the work of their priesthood. If a person was a lay person, same thing, some amount of prayer, but mainly confession.
Wonderful. I'm conscious of our time, and is it okay to ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm just wondering, do priests and religious orders come under spiritual attack more than lay people, or the church itself?
Well, it's hard to say about the church itself. I would say certainly, the church in general is the largest target, I think, for the enemy. In terms of the cases that we see, it's rare to have a religious or a priest be the subject of the exorcisms. There are those cases here and there over the years, but it's extremely rare. Now, are they under attack in terms of, temptation, despair, aridity of prayer? Sure. But generally, the person that's a priest or a religious is well catechized and is not dabbling in the occult or black magic. And really, that's what's kind of required to get into this level of trouble.
Yeah. Wow. I'm so grateful for our time together today. And I'm just going to ask you this last question, because I think as a creative person myself, there's always something that compels you to move forward with a creative activity. So I just would like to ask you, what compelled you to write this book?
I think it was God, mainly through the presence of Saint Michael. There was a strong sense of Saint Michael being around during the writing of this book. Other people with a lot of discernment that had no idea about that, I had never mentioned it, would bring that up. So that information was coming from multiple angles. And so I think in the end, we're here for a short time, and then our life is over. And I think these books, because there's more coming that I think God wants, I think this is a phase of my life where He's asking me and then helping me write down what He wants written down, so that when I'm gone, perhaps these books will be helpful to somebody else through the grace of God.
The book is The Catholic Guide to Miracles. The author is Adam BLAI. Adam, I thank you so much for your time today, and for taking the time to speak with me, and for sharing this deep wisdom with our listeners.
Well, thank you very much for the time, David. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play Music, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And visit our website at thefocusingway.com.